The Swoon of Babylon, a short story with some adult themes. The narrator recounts a curious book of erotica in the collection of a deceased book collector. When the book collector Harold Kent passed away, his son John contacted me regarding one of the books, one of his father's treasures. The son was going to keep the collection intact, for the most part, and was looking for a buyer who might purchase the entire ensemble. But there was the father's not inconsiderable collection of erotica, which the son proposed selling separately to a specialist. Amongst the erotica there was also one book that he thought stood out, and he wondered if it could be sold on its own. He was not proposing that I be a buyer, but he thought, wrongly, that I would know someone, some connoisseur, with the sort of money he was asking. I knew this would not be the case from the outset, but I didn't tell him so, purely because I was curious to see the book in question. In fact, I lied to him and said I might know a buyer, and a week later I asked to inspect the book a second time on behalf of this fictitious buyer, who wished to remain unnamed at that point, just so I could look over the work again and peruse its content in more depth. The book was called the Svenimento di Babilonia, the Swoon of Babylon, a translation into Italian with no indication of the original language, although I surmised it to be perhaps modern Turkish. There was an unlikely attribution in the marginalia of the last page to the Ottoman polymath and pornographer Jamali Pasha. I say unlikely, but not unreasonable, because the author of the Swoon of Babylon was most certainly a polymath and pornographer. The work covers matters of geography, history, commerce, maths and geometry, woven around its erotic premise. It is a lurid and vulgar text, remarkable for being laced with an explicit sexual vocabulary in a dozen languages, both known and unknown. One of its preoccupations is to collect as many names for the male member as possible. The Italian translator preserves these colourful terms from the original. The premise of the work is that a wealthy trader, Babek, who has grown rich by trading spices and perfumes along the Silky Road, has a good-for-nothing son, Cem. The father complains of his son's extreme indolence and frets about the lad's total lack of interest in sex. Cem, the father declares, is too lazy to fuck, a state he regards as the very definition of morbid lassitude. As a cure, the father sends his son on a journey with a trading caravan and puts him in the care of a courtesan, Roxala, who is instructed to take him to every whorehouse and bordello along the journey. Most of the narrative consists of Cem's erotic adventures travelling on an unspecified section of the Silky Road that terminates in Babylon, which itself is presented as a type of orgiastic paradise where all desires will be satisfied. In part, the work is an erotic manual and describes various modes of coition. Further to this, though, Cem discovers an astounding secret. The courtesans of his acquaintance, and Roxala principally, have a secret power by which they influence and control the world. It consists of certain spells that are innocently whispered into the ear of drowsy lovers. These spells enchant the men who are then, as it were, hypnotized. The kings and princes and shahs and viziers and wealthy men who come to the courtesans' beds leave under spells, entirely unaware. Should it be wished that an army invade a land, it is only necessary that the right spell be whispered in the ear of the drowsy commander, post-coital. Cem comes to understand that the courtesans of the caravanserai control the entire perfume trade along the Silky Road in this way. Even his father's wealth, finally, is under their control. In the end, Cem becomes so fearful of falling under such erotic spellcraft that he takes a vow of celibacy and retires into a monastery on the mountain of Arosipu. It is not a long work, the Swoon of Babylon, but it is fast-moving, written in short episodes, and there are signs it was intended as a gentleman's night book, a work intended to arouse, amuse and inform, all in a single gesture. John Kent had no Italian, so he couldn't read the content directly, but he was under the impression it was a work of the dark arts, as he called them. He recognised some occult content, astrological references and the like. This presented me with an opportunity to look over it long enough to say to him, "No, not really." The work did, I could see, address the occult sciences here and there, but only incidental to the story, which was unerringly obscene. He gave me time to read a few episodes to get a full appreciation of its nature. It would, I advised him, interest a collector of erotica much more than it would a collector of esoterica. There was no doubt as to the category to which it belonged. It was first and foremost pornographic. He had not the slightest notion of where his father might have procured such a work, but he knew it would be prized because his father had kept it in a locked safe box, along with a few other rarities he obviously valued. It had been rebound at some time with a type of faux dark green leather cover. Someone in English, but not Harold Kent, had added some underlining and just a few margin notes in pencil, but the book was otherwise unmolested. The longest note in pencil gave a summary: "The many escapades of Chem, the son of Barbek, and the whore Roxala on a journey to Babylon." This was on a page containing the bawdy doggerel, the Lament of Barbek, which I here bring roughly into English verse in a hope to capture its spirit. The Lament of Barbek. What sort of son would refuse to have fun, despite all the pleas of his father? Most boys of his age are already engaged, but it's laying around that he'd rather. He can't find the pucker to be a good fucker. He does as little fucking as he can. The lazy bone's bone is a bone left alone, but it's the bone that maketh the man. Oh, a young lad should be forward. There's a world of girls to be had, but my son insists that he's bored and won't even fuck for his dad. It is a light-hearted work, finally, the Swoon of Babylon, and it is perhaps satirical, although I cannot guess who is being satirised. I would guess that Barbek and his useless son are a caricature of someone, some dignitary or important person who is being ridiculed by a savage pen. An example of the occult or esoteric content of the work and how it is subsumed by the author's debauched agenda is the tale of the linguist's daughter. She sets out to discover which vowel sounds correspond to which of the four elements. It was a question that had puzzled sages and the learned for centuries. Is water, as many supposed, akin to the letter O, and fire to the letter A? Does air make you say ah or e? In the tale, the hero, Chem, is taken by Roxala to visit the linguist's daughter when she is attempting to settle the issue. Chem's task is first to pleasure her with fiery ardour, then with the gentle strokes of the wind, then like flowing water, and finally like a miner digging for gold. The indolent Chem complains that he's wearying and considers it a huge imposition, but eventually agrees. The linguist's daughter succumbs 4 times. In the first crescendo, she moans ah and ah. In the second, she moans I and E. In the third, it is O and O. And in the fourth, it is E and E. There were variations and gesticulations and an occasional "oh God, yes." But the results were clear. It was the primordial pattern. The question had been resolved. Much of the narrative, beyond a certain point, revolves explicitly around the hero's penis. Indeed, the penis of Chem becomes a character in the story. That happens in the following way. The laziness of Barbek's son was indeed prodigious. Initially, as his father complained, he was too lazy to fuck. Then, as Lady Roxala discovered, even when he did fuck, he was too lazy to finish. This had the unintended consequence of protecting him against her magical spells. Accordingly, when their caravan reached a certain city, she arranged that he should spend the night with a woman named Tishma, whose name, we are told, means dark abyss. No man, no matter how lazy, has ever been left unfinished by the dark abyss. Roxana prepares a spell, and when, inevitably, Chem falls into the dark abyss, the paramour whispers the spell into his left ear, just as he falls asleep. The spell works. Its purpose is to enchant his phallus with a disobedience spell, such that in the morning and thereafter his member would assert a reckless independence against Chem's lassitude and would disobey Chem's every effort to subdue it. This is Chem's predicament for most of the Swoon of Babylon. He himself is lazy and indifferent, as lazy as a rock, but the penis of Chem has other plans. They are locked in a mighty struggle. There are many episodes where Chem and his penis quarrel, and where Chem complains that he is exhausted and needs to rest. Invariably, the penis of Chem wins the day. It is only at the end of the book that Chem learns about the spell of Roxana. He grows wise to the cunning of the courtesans. When a man is most vulnerable, most helpless, when a man is spent, when all defences are gone, is when they whisper their spells deep into a man's heart. Seeking protection against this insidious magic, Chem visits an old woman with knowledge of spellcraft. Her cure is simple. She drops wax into his left ear. It did nothing to quell the disobedience spell on his phallus, but he was now immune to any further enchantments. It is after this, and one last harrowing argument with the penis of Chem, that he decides to take a life of celibacy, the final solution, and makes plans to travel off to Mount Rosapu. The hundreds of names, medical and colloquial, for the penis recorded in the Swoon of Babylon can be divided into several categories. First, there are simple nicknames like Donald or Dick. Some are adjectival, the nudger, the pink intruder. Then there are more specific terms, some quite obscure, such as the following: the chachi, the jumbo, the poput, the samcho, the lond, the zosh, the big shishna, the quabble, the mobrong. The work catalogues them with delight, claiming them to be the synonyms from 100 strange tongues along the Silky Road. Roxana herself is said to know the word for penis in 100 languages, civilised and barbarous. There is hardly a page of the Swoon that doesn't introduce some new and exotic term for the male organ. Chem's quest for indolence is continually thwarted, though, just as he thinks he has the better of his troublesome appendage, and the narrative of the Swoon of Babylon seems to be returning to a steady pace with long descriptions of his idleness. The caravan in which he is travelling comes to a crossroad, where the Via Cumos meets the Via di Cumos, that was marked with a massive phallic herm. "All hail!" cries the penis of Chem, suddenly reinvigorated. Before they could pass, the caravan is expected to make homage to the Ithyphallic gods, and so Roxana announces 11 nights of games. Although the work gives no general account of such monuments, herms are described as marking crossroads on all the silkier parts of the Silky Roads, and we are told in a discursus that most of them were established by Alexander, known as the Great for various reasons, this being one of them, as part of his eternal tryst with an Amazon queen, signed and sealed, we are told, in the sleep of Xylam. The sleep of Xylam is mysterious. Chem falls into it several times at the instigation of Roxana, but what it actually involves I was not able to make out in the time I spent with the book. The penis of Chem swears by it. By the sleep of Xylam, it swears several times, in its seething feuds with the sexless sun. There are a lot of agricultural metaphors too. There's a lot of ploughing of fields, a lot of inserting the shovel, burying the worm, scattering seed, that sort of thing. There are a lot of cooking metaphors as well, stirring the pot, stoking the oven, poaching the parsnip, and so on. Primarily, though, the metaphors are astrological. And this is another reason John Kent thought the work was an opus of the dark arts. Chim's Mars is exalted on the cusp of Roxala's Virgo. Their sun and moon are conjunct. Chim's tongue is sextile to Roxala's Venus. Chim's big fat prorogator moved into Roxala's mutable quadrant, and they spent the night in transit. In some passages it might be possible, I would say, to construct whole horoscopes from descriptions of their lovemaking. The theme is developed in one of the early chapters when Chem is sent to visit a lady of the night named Zabuna, who had beguiling stars in her eyes, and that, it was said, even the laziest of men could not resist. It has been explained to her that Chem is the son of a wealthy trader, but he's too lazy to fuck. She cast Chem's horoscope for diagnostic purposes to ascertain the source of the problem, then takes him to bed. What follows is 11 pages of detailed and lurid descriptions of their sexual encounter, told entirely in terms of astrological notation. Zabuna surmounts his midheaven, moves trine to the ruler of his ascendant, and applies her quincunx all the way to his 12th house. By the morning his essential dignities and planetary rulership had been turned topsy-turvy. Everybody said that what the boy needed was a good celestializing. It didn't make him any less lazy, and his Saturn was still retrograde, but it made his Cauda Draconis sit up and pay attention. All of this, as I say, struck me as the stuff of a gentleman's night book to be kept on the bedside, although that genre also included pornographic works written specifically for bedsides in brothels and bordellos. I wondered if that was the case, given the nature of Chem's adventures. Roxala escorts him to one establishment after another, introducing him to experts, women of renown. As well as detours into fanciful geography, the text also dwells in places on the architecture of such establishments. In one episode, Roxala escorts the lazy son to such a place, and the text describes its splendid layout, its windows and fittings, and eulogises the architect, Del Barbi, who of course is said to have had a massive penis. It is at this masterpiece of design by Del Barbi, replete with playrooms, that Roxala introduces Chem to the wild woman Kerenisha, who had been known to have killed men with a thrashing of her hips. Chem survives but is shaken. He tells Roxala he wants to throw himself into a volcano. This ennui and Chem's lassitude is next challenged by direct intervention. Exasperated by his indifference and his determination to throw himself into a volcano, Roxala enlists the assistance of an unnamed Nubian maid, an expert in her craft, and together they put Chem's stamina to the test. It is a notable passage because, as well as describing the encounter, it sets out at the same time the famous theorem of Pythagoras with a squared and b squared and Chem as the hypotenuse. The running assumption throughout the Swoon of Babylon is that Chem requires a thorough education, including, in this episode, instruction in the geometry of love. Called upon to make love to both of the ladies simultaneously, he is pushed to his limits, but at least learns the difference between a right-angled triangle and an isosceles. If we ask what sort of reader might be tantalised by such a work, I am again inclined to call it a gentleman's night book. On the second occasion I was able to look at the work, I managed to read more or less in full one of the longer episodes. It is right in the centre of the book, and if you open the book up it tends to fall onto this part of the narrative. There is an episode where young Chem is being instructed in a new sexual position by a lady from Khorasan. The position is a favourite among her people, she explains, a treasure of their tradition. It was simple in execution. The lady from Khorasan lay on her back with her legs in the air and knees slightly bent. She instructed Chem to kneel between her legs and hold onto her ankles, supporting them wide and high. It's called the eagle, she told him. Later, looking out over the desert from the balcony of her rooms, she drew Chem's attention to the constellation known everywhere as the eagle, swooping that evening above the western horizon. It was Chem's favourite constellation. He was an impossible stargazer. "What do you see?" she asked him. "The bird or the lovers?" Chem looked again. Suddenly he realised that the constellation, though it resembled an eagle in flight, actually and more accurately depicted lovers in that very embrace. The lady of Karazhan showed him other constellations. She pointed to the north. "Men call those stars the basket, don't they?" she asked. "Can you see the man sitting with one leg outstretched and the other leg bent at the knees so that he can balance?" Chem looked and joined the dots between the stars. "Can you see the woman sitting in his lap? Those 3 stars in a row are her torso. See how he suckles her breasts." It was perfectly clear to Chem. He could see it plainly. After that she showed him the bottle, the frog, the rainbow, the workhorse, the swan, the plough, the waterfall, the spider, the nest, the ship, the anvil, the tower, the gazelle, the tulip, the candle, and the kissing fish. For the first time, Chem realised that the constellations are, in reality, depictions of celestial lovers, and that God, merciful and beneficent be He, has provided mankind with a manual of delights that might be consulted every night. The scales and the ram and the bull are the astrology of fools. The stars actually depict all the ways of love. Prudes and simpletons only see a few stars that people have told them look a bit like a wheelbarrow. They don't see the woman kneeling on one leg with her other leg extended to the lower reddish star, or how she leans on the opposing elbow while her partner, his hands grasping her hips, kneels behind her. Once you see it, it's obvious. Throughout his journeys, Chem becomes acquainted with a host of sexual positions with astrological prototypes. It's one of the themes of the Swoon of Babylon. The work presents one position after another, all of them with correlates in the stars. Chem had always laid about gazing at the stars. His father had caned him for it. Now he knew the secret. For all of that, such esoteric themes are only a scaffold in the work. What the author likes doing, above all, is writing smut. It is ambitious, though, and even has a subplot. Among his fellow travellers in the caravan that was moving onwards to swooning Babylon, through all the 28 stations of the Silky Road, Chem sought inspiration from a fakir named Uncle Farouk. He was sagacious and apparently immune to the wiles of Roxala and her ilk. He turns up in several places in the narrative. Uncle Farouk is described as resolute. Like Chem, he showed no interest in fleshly pleasures, but in his case it was for mystico-religious reasons. Deterred, ladies would say to him, "Oh, Uncle Farouk, how is it you are so resolute?" And Uncle Farouk would say, "I know what is in the Book of Celestial Mysteries." He was a bit too agile and energetic and given to work for Chem's liking, but he was definitely resolute. At every way stop, at every brothel, at every invitation, ladies would ask him, "Oh, Uncle Farouk, how is it you are so resolute?" They would call it out from their doorsteps and bedroom windows, and Uncle Farouk would say, "I know what is in the Book of Celestial Mysteries." Chem could learn from a man like him. But one day when the caravan came to a certain city, this is the last episode in the book, word had spread in advance, and the lady who awaited him was none other than Layla, Night, the embodiment of all things dark and luscious. She is described as the darkest of all dark beauties. She lived veiled inside the city walls, luxuriating in its shadows. The lure of her gaze was said to be beyond the resistance of mortals. If any man could resist her overtures, thought Chem, it was surely Uncle Farouk. When the caravan arrived, the entire city came out to watch. Night emerged in her black lingerie. Uncle Farouk remained resolute. When nothing worked, the good lady let down her hair, which, according to the narrative, was jet black and flowed down to the dimples of her bottom. The onlookers all took a deep breath. Night had never let down her hair before. She looked Uncle Farouk squarely in the eyes. "Oh, Uncle Farouk, how is it you're so resolute?" she asked. "I know what is in the Book of Celestial Mysteries," he replied. She held his gaze. "What is in the Book of Celestial Mysteries?" she asked him. Remarkably, no one had ever asked him before. There was a pause that incubated everything. Then Uncle Farouk revealed what was in the Book of Celestial Mysteries. "A prophylactic and a letter from my lover, Zareen," he said. Then he stood up and held out his hand to her. There was wild celebration and energetic orgy throughout the city as Knight and Uncle Farouk made off to a boudoir in their celestial embrace. After that, Chem felt that his own plight might be hopeless. Despairing and disappointed, on the final page of the work, he walks off to Mount Arosipu, singing the love song of indolent Chem. The love song of indolent Chem. As I sail across this desert land, and every night's a one-night stand, with spells whispered in my ear, the more I long to linger, and never lift a finger, never shift my gear stick into gear. Oh, I love to lay in bed alone, and doing nothing till the morning. Some lady gay can play away. I'll be laying there and yawning. I'm Chem, the son of Barbek. There's no one as uninterested as me. With no bone to moan, I'm never in the zone, and sail the ship of sloth upon the celibacy sea. Hoping that John Kent might let me time with the book on a third occasion, I invented more details of the story to the effect that my interested book buyer wished to remain anonymous, ongoing, and was depending upon me for a complete assessment of the worth of the volume. I described it to him. He was very interested. Could I describe it to him in greater particulars? Eventually, though, I would have to say that my buyer had taken a change of mind for unspecified reasons. I certainly didn't have the money myself. The son's only interest in his father's books, this treasure included, was financial. That I found the Swoon fascinating was not a reason for him to keep it aside from me. And sure enough, the next time I contacted him, he told me it had been moved, as he described it. Who purchased it? He was sworn not to say. Similarly, whoever bought the bulk of the Harold Kent library did so through an agent, and the same with the other books marked as unique or exceptional by being kept in the locked safe box with the Swoon. That is all normal, especially in the case of deceased estates. Collectors don't like to be seen as vultures. Codes of discretion come even more into play with erotic works, and collectors of occult titles are secretive and clandestine by nature. He was a good-looking lad, Chem, tall and strapping. The penis of Chem was too. There were no impediments to a love life. The old women matchmakers his father had consulted in desperation said he wasn't queer, just a miserable slug. An erection seemed like hard work to the boy. They had suggested the services of Roxala as a cure. That is the point at which the text begins, the old women directing Barbek to the courtesan. It's impossible to say whether the Kent copy of the Swoon was the only extant copy of the work, or the only copy ever made, the only translation made of an original unknown. It was probably a gentleman's notebook, probably a satire about someone and his son, but the author has brought in a raft of intriguing material and woven it into a type of obscene travellogue. Now the Kent copy has disappeared into a private collection, and it may not surface again until that collector passes away and his collection is sold off by his son.